And now I have the honor to hand over to Hille Haker. She's professor at the Richard McCormick Endowed Chair of Ethics at the Loyola University in Chicago. And her talk is entitled Power, Morality, and Sexual Violence in the Catholic Church. Hille, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And now, do you see the PowerPoint?
No, sorry, you seem to be sharing the wrong screen.
So, let me see. It is not that important anyway, but I thought. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I just have a few slides so that you can read alongside with me, but I am actually reading my text and I've shortened it a bit. So it will be a little bit bumpy in the beginning and some of the transitions might actually be not as smooth. That's because I tried to shorten it. Marie, thank you very, very much. There will be a little bit of an overlap here, but I hope it will not hurt. Doris, thank you very much for the invitation, and Frederica and Jan and everyone who has been helping here and organizing this. It's a real honor to speak. It is difficult too, but let me try. I want to first quickly review some elements of the sexual abuse crisis in view of the demands for reform, and then take up some insights from studies on the relationship of power, shame, and epistemic injustice. I will then finish with some constructive thoughts. So without further ado, oh my gosh. Okay, let me just start with the first part. The response of the non-clerical part of the church can be characterized as outrage and despair, cynicism and fight. Many Catholics call for reforms. They have two major demands regarding the sexual violence and abuse committed by Catholic priests. The first demand concerns the understanding of priesthood because the sublimation of their status is seen as part of the problem. After the decades-long silence and silencing of victims and their families, the attitude at the turn of the century first applied the bad apple theory, meaning that the church just had to get rid of or sort out the individuals without further changes to the priesthood or church in general. This individualization of the structural problem was closely connected to the crime against the sacrament of priesthood theory, which showed considerable outrage and concern about the damage done to the church, still mostly ignoring the damage done to the victims. Rome, with its two popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, misjudged the depth of the moral failure. They fought for the moral integrity of the church by focusing on a new evangelization with little concern for the realities of the people to be evangelized. Francis, too, has tried this strategy. Joe René Formicola has recently argued that the last three popes all have approached sexual violence with view on the perpetrators and the theology of sin, rather than making the victims and their harm the center of reflection. The popes also believed that they were in fraternal solidarity with their brother priests due to the sacrament of holy orders. They held that they were all granted a special ontological gift known as grace that would allow priests to overcome sin, to repent, to be forgiven, and to be reconciled to God. The priest's salvation, therefore, was of primary concern to the popes. His ability to be redeemed would also justify a priest's return to ministry. I think I can make that a little bit bigger, right? Let me see. I don't see what you see. So the fraternal solidarity may explain why the victims of abuse have played such little role in the church's response. The second demand that reformers have issued concerns the change of the overall framework of Catholic sexual and gender ethics. With many others, including several feminist ethicists, I have long argued from an ethical perspective that sexuality is neither a sin nor a crime, but sexual and sexualized violence is. In my view, this simple fact changes everything, because the whole assessment of what is wrong in sexual conduct must be revisited. In other words, while there are many different ways of good sexuality and sexual acts, it is sexualized violence that defines the wrongfulness of sexual conduct. Likewise, gender identity is but one element of a person's identity, and it is incomprehensible that one's physical features should define a gender hierarchy. Up to today, the Church is not willing to make this shift. Instead, it continues to spread certain myths that sexual abusers are pedophiles, that gay men are potential abusers and ontologically not worthy to become or be a priest. The biggest myth, however, concerns the so-called Western sexual libertinage, which Joseph Ratzinger in particular has continuously condemned and associated not only with moral decadence, but also with sexualized violence. Cynically, John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis are very committed to a battle against the so-called gender ideology, including the stigmatization of gay and lesbian, intersex, and transgender people. In 2016, Pope Francis even called gender-sensitive education an ideological colonization, as if there were some elitist educators colonizing innocent children with their gender ideology. Think of that for a moment and compare it with the hesitance to apologize for the crimes committed in the name of the Church. Compare the gender debate regarding the recognition of transgender, lesbian, and gay adolescents with the re-education programs to which indigenous children were subjected throughout the 20th century, mostly done in Catholic schools. Regarding the demands for a reform of the understanding of priesthood, including the ordination of women and the change of the framework of sexual and gender morality, there's no move. Rome is stonewalling, and the reformers are treated as reformers have always been treated in the history of the Church. They are ignored, marginalized, shamed, and silenced. It does not take much to see that the connection between the response to the victims of sexual abuse and violence and the response to the critics is the exercise of power with little accountability. Those of us who believe that priests or nuns have no right to be treated differently than any other moral agents, and they too are accountable for their actions, are often identified as the real problem. We are shamed into silence, called to pray, to repent, to fast, and to obey, while the priests, bishops, cardinals, and the Pope are not existentially questioned by this crisis. Many may still think that it will go away when they have apologized, but the truth will not go away. It will continue to be revealed, and it will be remembered. Over the last few years, major reports have been published by local bishops' conferences. New guidelines from the Vatican and the reformed canon law are now waiting to be installed. After the release of the 2018 report in Germany and the 2019 Pennsylvania report, the Cardinal Penn report in Australia in 2019, or the McCarrick report in 2020, and the recent findings of the Polish State Commission on Pedophilia that for the first time accused the secretary to John Paul II, Cardinal Stanislav Dziwisz, of ignoring reports of sexual abuse, it is certainly now up to Francis to correct and reform. But it is up to all members of the Church to urge him to at least respond to the two demands for reform. In 2018, Francis evoked the blood of Abel in his letter to the people of God, speaking of the victims of sexual violence, their cries that are heard by God, and perhaps by God only. The heart-wrenching pain of these victims, Francis wrote, which cries out to heaven, was long ignored, kept quiet or silenced. But their outcries was more powerful than all the measures meant to silence it, or sought even to resolve it by decisions that increased its gravity by falling into complicity. The Lord heard that cry and once again showed us on which side he stands. This is a stunning summary of the last 50 years. The systemic nature of violence was revealed in the reports about the mother and baby homes in Ireland, the final report only published in January of this year. Likewise, the report on the systematic torture of Indigenous children in Canadian Catholic schools in May revealed the finding of 213 corpses of infants at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia. This shows that sexuality is but one problem. Indifference to the well-being of another person is. Disrespect to a dependent is. The celebration of power in asymmetric relations is. And the distribution of responsibilities in hierarchical institutions is just as big a problem. Together, these factors have resulted in sometimes sadistic spiritual abuse in the form of sexual, physical, and emotional violence. Nobody ever believed us, said Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Canada's country's largest Indigenous organization, repeating what so many survivors of sexual violence and their advocates have experienced over the years too. I come to my second part. Epistemic power, shame, and shaming. Authoritarianism. The abuse of power is possible in any institution, but it seems to flourish especially in so-called total institutions with authoritarian structures, the forcing houses for changing persons, as Goffman had it, and Marie Keenan has worked on that too in her book, that not only stigmatize individuals, but also allow crimes to happen without accountability. The silence of the victims is often caused by an epistemic blindness by those who hold power, and the collective responsibility seems to exonerate individuals. As Iris Marion Young has shown, very similar to Ulrich Beck actually, sometimes all individuals may even do the right thing and yet produce injustice. This seems to have been the case when the response to assaults or abuse was to call the perpetrators to repent, followed by the promise of forgiveness. In addition to the epistemic blindness towards violence and violation of dignity, an effect of authoritarian structures is that the members of the church institutions, monasteries, boarding schools, or orphanages accommodate to the situation. Murray's point of the paradox of power. Members of the church, for instance, have been told again and again that they cannot and indeed must not change the institutional structures. Instead, they are called to pray, to fast, to repent, as Francis asked the people of God to do in 2018 in the letter I quoted from already. This can awaken our conscience, the fasting and so on, and arouse our solidarity and commitment to a culture of care that says never again to every form of abuse. In his letter, Francis speaks about the victims, but all faithful are called to repent. But not all of us are perpetrators or even bystanders. Many of us are indeed victims, survivors, and advocates. We are not being taken seriously until our demands are taken seriously. The transformation of priesthood and the change of sexual morality. I believe that it is crucial to analyze the inherent authoritarianism of the church institutions, not only in the administration and the distribution of power and responsibility, but also in its core ideology that defines Christian discipleship as obedience when it is coerced submission and service even in the exercise of blunt power. To acknowledge the link between Christianity and authoritarianism is crucial because we witness a revival of authoritarian social and political movements that threaten democracy, freedom, and the human rights of individuals on a broader political scale. These movements are often embraced and fired up by members of the Catholic Church. Supporters include lay members of the new religious movements, so fostered by John Paul II, Catholic priests, bishops, and cardinals, the former Pope Joseph Ratzinger, and the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, who for decades so vehemently fought against the new political theology, liberation and feminist theologies, play a dubious role in this nostalgic Christian authoritarianism, as I call it. Together with John Paul II, Benedict is a prominent reference point for the critics who condemn the foundations of modernity, especially moral autonomy and the demand of gender equality that questions the male clerical supremacy. The critique of the so-called gender ideology is especially loud, harsh, and uncompromising, whereas the responsibility for the sexual, physical, and emotional violence is pushed from one corner of the church to the other. Testimonial justice. The reports and the multiple publications that have appeared over the last 2 decades are great progress. Truth begins with revelation, and the testimonies of the victim survivors are the most important condition to change the narrative of the sacred church that itself cannot fail. These testimonies become a broader public narrative with the tremendous work of journalists, documentarians, historians, psychologists, sociologists, and last not least, theologians. Together, they demonstrate that violence within the Catholic Church is indeed systemic, and it won't help to point at other institutions who may deal with similar problems. Without knowledge, no acknowledgement. Without testimonies, no accountability of the perpetrators, no responsibility of those who could have prevented more harm, and no ongoing responsibility of all of us who are entangled in this history as victims and survivors, bystanders, or implicated subjects, as Michael Rothberg has called it. Without knowledge, we do not even know how exactly we can and ought to respond. The capability to speak, to remember, to act, and to account for one's actions is therefore, as Paul Ricoeur has emphasized in his study on recognition, a moral capability. Epistemic injustice. Who is able to speak? Who has the power to speak? Who is heard? By whom? In what way? It is a long way from the silence of suffering to finding a voice. And not everyone is able or willing to speak. Sometimes one is too afraid to confront one's trauma. Sometimes one has no words because there is no public language for one's experience. Suffering silences, but the lack of public language is the result of social blindness. If there is no language for sexual violence, for the different kinds of abuse, there is no recognition of it, and those who experience it are rendered wrong, not normal, disruptive. I too am entangled in the history of sexual violence. For decades, I've struggled with my own case. I became a theologian and an ethicist, and my work depends on my voice and my words. I am, of course, also shaped by the structural vulnerability as a female feminist Catholic ethicist. We, not the priests or bishops, were questioned in our work integrity. We were told that our views distort the teachings of the church. No apology will suffice, for instance, to repair the damage done to so many theologians, including my friend and colleague Regina Amicht-Quinn, who was denied the nihil obstat by Reinhard Marx in his time as Bishop of Trier. Miranda Fricker has coined the term as epistemic injustice. She distinguishes between testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial injustice is a kind of injustice, quote, in which someone is wronged specifically in her capacity as a knower. And it refers to the lack of credibility that certain people or groups have in a given social or legal setting. Hermeneutical injustice is, quote, the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experiences obscured from collective understanding owing to a structural identity prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resource. The result is what Fricker calls an economy of credibility, defined by excess or deficit credibility. I find this concept helpful because it shifts the focus from a psychological explanation of moral harm to the epistemic standing of the different subjects or groups involved. Several scholars have developed Fricker's concept further, with a helpful distinction made by Christy Dodson, who points to testimonial quieting, that I call silencing. That is, when persons are not listened to and their testimony is received with utter silence and indifference, or testimonial smothering, that is, the repression of one's own knowledge in certain environs. Here I see the link between epistemic injustice and authoritarian structures that repress knowledge and allow transgression of moral and legal rules without repercussion. The effect is the repression of one's own testimonial knowledge. In testimonial smothering, the speaker themselves withholds their testimony. They smother their testimony because the credibility economy is such that their audience may be hostile, may ridicule the speaker, or worse. And so while the speaker decides for themselves not to speak, it's often due to a pre-existing injustice in practices of uptake and credibility assessments. Thus, the speaker is still excluded by broader social forces, and testimonial smothering is just another form of epistemic oppression. The principle of dignity. In Catholic ethics, dignity is regarded as the most important principle of morality. Modernity understands it mostly as the moral subject's agency as moral autonomy. Dignity is meant to rein in the dangers of social conventions, and it therefore comes with a social critical force. The tragedy of Catholic ethics is, however, that it embraces dignity as privilege or even property. Having been created in the image of God, as the book of Genesis tells it, was long held that humans enjoy a privileged place in creation, masters over other creatures, not the least over women and children. Long into modernity, supremacy meant mastery over indigenous people, and the path to salvation always led to the Catholic Church. Dignity as privilege is incompatible with dignity that reflects the dialectic of vulnerability and agency, as I've argued in some of my other works. Our vulnerability to illness, suffering and death is certainly important, but dignity must be understood first and foremost in relation to moral vulnerability. The suffering that is caused by another person adds to the underlying trauma of pain. It has been described as identity shock, a rupture of belonging and trust in the world, Jean-Emery, and a widerfahrenes of humiliation, an experience, pathos of humiliation. The violation of dignity is a violation of our moral standing. A common effect of humiliation is the affect of shame. Generally speaking, shame is an important moral concept, often seen as an indicator of transgression of norms. Shame is at its core about exposure, either of one's vulnerability to moral harm or of one's moral guilt. Bernard Williams explains the ancient Greek origin of the concept. The basic experience connected with shame is that of being seen inappropriately by the wrong people in the wrong condition. It is straightforwardly connected with nakedness, particularly in sexual connections. Augustine, or Augustine as we say here, in his influential writings on sin and guilt, sees shame not so much as an effect of being exposed and exploited in one's vulnerability, but as an effect of guilt. It is rooted in the original sin that makes humans aware not only of their nakedness, but moreover of their uncontrollable will. As Richard Miller has argued in a recent essay, for Augustine, venereal sexual pleasure manifests itself at the interface of the voluntary and the involuntary, threatening to divide the self against itself. There are two flaws in Augustine's reflection. First, Augustine's understanding of sexual desire at the interface of the voluntary and the involuntary may well serve as an excuse in the case of assault and abuse. Second, Augustine does not address the shame that a victim may feel, but shame as response to guilt is different from shame as response to humiliation. For the subject of humiliation, shame or addressee of humiliation, shame is different from, or at least prior to, guilt. And importantly, the sense of guilt may well originate in social norms that blame the victim. At least this holds true to women. One of the greatest myths of rape is that women themselves must have caused it. Shame that is connected to the moral harm of humiliation renders a person misrecognized. With Williams, we can say a person is seen in the wrong way. Shame disempowers the self. It cannot be overcome by psychological responses only. In the moral process of bringing about justice, the position of power must be reverted, and this can only happen through public recognition. Shane Muldoon says, the answer for sexual assault survivors is not to be treated for their problem, an implicit person blame approach to survivors, but rather to reaffirm their worth as citizens, to punish offenders, to have their assault denounced by society's criminal justice system, and to have an affirmative institutional response for them and against the social fact of their sexual assault. So let me come to my conclusion. I want to end on a constructive note. By now, I think we know what we need to fight for. First, for the epistemic justice that needs to be done to victims and survivors. Holding back or impeding investigations must no longer be an option. But those of us who cannot or do not want to speak have every right to keep silent, to speak, to remember, to act, and to hold oneself and others accountable are certainly elements of moral agency. But victims of violence have to regain their trust in the world that is the witnesses, the bystanders, the friends, and communities. They all have the responsibility to create environments to make this possible. There are many different ways to do this. Second, the demand to change the understanding of priesthood is not just about inclusion of women or the abolition of coerced celibacy. Our demand must be to change the authoritarian ideology that understands obedience as submission and power as service. Discipleship has many faces, and priesthood is but one way to follow Christ. Third, the reform of Catholic sexual and gender ethics from an ideal of sexuality to the negation of the negative, namely violence, is perhaps the most urgent demand that theologians ought to fight for. Catholic sexual ethics has hurt millions and millions of people, and it exposes LGBTI individuals to stigmatization and discrimination. It must stop. Fourth, I believe that a new political virtue ethics is necessary. It is centered on the four cardinal virtues reinterpreted. First, parrhesia as the courage to speak truth to power. Second, resistance and witnessing as constancy or perseverance. And this I follow Hans Küng, who argued that constancy is different from temperance, which may easily be used as a bait to false realism, preventing individuals and groups from demanding reforms. But we also need to foster, third, the strategic thinking about the reform of this church. This is captured in the virtue of prudence. Last not least, we need to humbly develop the virtue of justice as righteousness. It means that we need to always ask whether we ourselves are fair, treat others equally and with respect, and practice justice, including epistemic justice, in our own struggle for justice in the church. Power and the temptation to abuse is a challenge to all of us. The intersecting powers of sex, race, and class are relevant for the analysis of the power structure in the church too. For instance, poor women of color might not be found anywhere near the ranks of decision-making. Lay theologians are teaching with all necessary qualifications, but often without titles or secure positions. They do not have the power to ensure that their work is even read. Many people, women especially, are present behind the scenes, invisible, comforting those who suffer from different kinds of pain, illness, and death, including the social death within their church. Our struggle is no longer about forgiveness and reconciliation. It is about the renewal of the church. No peace without justice, says the prophet Isaiah. No peace without justice, says the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Peace in the church does not concern the priests first and the victims last, but vice versa. It must take those who have been harmed and are still being harmed as the subjects, the center, and the criterion of theological truth. We are all entangled in this history of violence and its economy of power, but we all come with different stories, different backgrounds, and different powers to act. Power, rightly understood, is the opposite of domination. Power is creative, cooperative, and communicative. In order to empower ourselves, we need to develop the political virtues of courage, perseverance, prudence, and justice, together with the theological virtues of faith as trust, love as compassion, and hope against hope. We should be well equipped for the struggle that lies ahead. And with this, I hope we can begin a new conversation right now and in the church. Thank you.